welcome back. I am Mr. Sosatris. It is Monday, and I wanted to do a book review for you today. I recently finished reading The Bonesetter's Daughter by Amy Tan, and there was a lot in this that just stuck with me, and I really wanted to kind of talk about it a little more in depth than just kind of the quick blurb that I posted to Shorts. Was this a perfect book? No, but was this a really interesting and compelling read? Yes. There's a lot in here that I really wanted to kind of dig into, and just there's some cool stuff. This is the third book by Amy Tan that I've read. I've read The Joy Luck Club and The Valley of Amazement. They always say, like, you have to read 3 books by an author to get a sense of what their style is and what you like about them and whatever. And I think after reading this, it's safe to say that Amy Tan is definitely one of my favorite writers. I just love her stuff. This book is really interesting. It's a two not parallel stories, but there's 2 plot lines in here. The first is set in the present day, and you've got the character Ruth and her mother, her aging mother, and there's just kind of they have a difficult relationship. Ruth doesn't feel very connected to her mother, and she feels like her mother is always criticizing her or doesn't really understand where she's coming from. There's kind of a lack of context between the two. And then over the course of the story, she kind of discovers that her mother is facing kind of a serious health issue and needs to kind of help her through that. And so you've got kind of all the difficulties that come from that. There's also a second plot line, which happens kind of in the middle of the book, that tells the story of her mother when she was living in China, and growing up, and also going through kind of the tumultuous years right before World War II, during World War II, and then kind of her immigration to America after World War II, and kind of the difficult struggles that she faced, and all that. Throughout all of this, there's this running theme of this person that her mother knew when she was younger. She calls her precious auntie, and she's looking for her name, and she doesn't remember what her name is. And so there's something important about that character. And so in the past and present, you've got both characters relating to each other, the mother and daughter, but then you've also got this kind of this not literal haunting by this third person who was really important to her mother, but you don't really find out exactly how until kind of later on in the book. And so this was it was a really compelling read. The 2 plot lines work really well. I was a little concerned at first when, you're reading the one set in the present, and I was really invested, and then it kind of ends, and then you jump back to the past, and then you have like an extended section in there, and I was worried that like the flow would be kind of off, going from the present to the past, and then after a long time coming back to the present, but it worked out really well. This was a really enjoyable read, and so I wanted to dig into it a little bit and just see what we can find. Before I get into the review, I did want to address a sort of controversy maybe that comes up every now and then surrounding Tan's writing. I really, really love her work, and I really respect her as a writer, but there have been some other Asian American writers who say that Amy Tan tends to resort to stereotypes and Orientalism in order to appeal to white audiences. And I'm white, so like I don't know enough about the culture to know kind of what is accurate and what isn't. But I do think we always need to be very critical readers, especially when you're reading fiction. You don't want to accept a fictional book as presenting sort of the absolute literal truth of what a cultural experience is. One thing to be kind of aware of, a book that I read in college is Orientalism by Edward Said. And in this one, he's talking more about kind of the Near East and how it's viewed in England and France, but he does mention the perception of kind of the Far East, China, Korea, Japan, and how it's viewed by kind of American audiences. What Orientalism is when a culture becomes sort of an aesthetic that's strictly there for flash and dash. It's there strictly to be kind of appealing. It's sort of exoticized. It's distilling a culture, like a real culture with people and, you know, all this stuff, down into kind of a vibe that lends itself really terribly to things like stereotypes and dehumanization. It's when you kind of turn a culture into just an aesthetic, and that becomes what people think of as kind of the real version of that culture. If you think of, I'm thinking of, okay, the Sinbad movies from the 50s, like the Ray Harryhausen ones with like the stop motion monsters. I love those so much, but the depictions of like the Middle East and the Near East and like Northern Africa and everything is very, like, everything is exotic. The women are very very alluring, and the, you know, like the clothes are all very shimmery and colorful, and it's not really about presenting a culture realistically. It's about like taking a culture and like turning it into like almost a theme park version of the culture, just to make it kind of appealing and flashy. So when you watch a Sinbad movie, you're not watching it to learn anything about the culture. You're watching it, you know, just for a fun adventure, and it may very well just be set in like a far off fantasy world that has nothing to do with the real world. Like there's no real connection to the actual culture. And so the effect that has on Western audiences is it reinforces colonial stereotypes, where you think like, sure, they have all the wealth and stuff, but they're just kind of silly, and they're not very serious. And, you know, we are the rational, you know, white people, and we deserve to be on top, and they deserve to serve us because they're just kind of, they're not capable of sort of governing themselves. Like, it's really dangerous. You see this in R.F. Kuang's Babel. And so, you know, you have to be aware of that. Even though Amy Tan is an Asian American writer, you do have to kind of be aware of that disconnect that happens. I'm thinking of the book Memoirs of a Geisha, and the movie. The book was written by Arthur Golden, who's a white guy, and it's presented as being very factual and realistic, but there's quite a few things about the culture that he got wrong. But like, American audiences didn't know enough about the culture to realize that what he was depicting was incorrect, and so they saw it as fairly literal. And then you've got the movie, which was again made by white people, and they cast Chinese actors playing Japanese characters, which doesn't make sense. The only good thing that we got out of Memoirs of a Geisha is John Williams' soundtrack, because I feel like he's the only person in that whole thing who genuinely did like the proper research, and his depiction of like Japanese music feels very respectful. But that's a tangent. I just love John Williams, and that's bad. But anyways, going back to the book, Amy Tan never, and she said this in kind of interviews, she never intends this to be like a literal depiction of what Chinese culture is like. Her work is kind of impressionistic. Her focus is always on like family relationships, so mothers and daughters. She uses the cultural differences, like the cultural disconnect that's there sometimes, and she exaggerates it a little bit in order to kind of show the difference, but it's done in a symbolic, poetic way. It's not meant to be like, you know, if you read this, you know exactly what it's like to live in China at this time. She does historical fiction, but her focus is always on telling human stories, and her work is always kind of informed by her own life, her own relationship with her mother, which I've read is quite difficult. I'm thinking also of the movie Turning Red, which is Pixar, but it's again, it takes this kind of disconnect between like a naturalized daughter and a more traditional mother, and it really plays up kind of the cultural aspects in kind of interesting ways. So you've got, you know, the culture, they highlight the culture, and obviously the people who were making that were trying to kind of show the beauty of the culture and all that stuff. But in doing so, they did kind of exaggerate things. They did resort to like some stereotypes, and even though the story that they tell is very good, you can't look at something like Turning Red and say, okay, that's exactly what it's like to be like Asian in Canada. And it's like, no, it's impressionistic, it's exaggerated, it's not realistic, and there are stereotypes there because they're trying to appeal to a wide audience. And sometimes that's not good, sometimes it's not bad, but you always need to be a critical reader, and you always want to ask questions. You always want to do your own research and dig into stuff more. If you're interested about the cultural aspects of the book, you want to read more like first-hand account or like historical accounts, stuff like that, to get more of a better idea of what the culture is like. This is a novel, and so it's fictional. No one's going to read Moby Dick and imagine that it's a literal account of exactly what it's like to be chasing down an enormous white whale in a boat at sea. Even though it pretends to be like really factual and detail oriented, if you focus on that, then you're not like, there's a lot of stuff that he gets wrong about whaling, even though he was on a whaling ship. But there's a lot of stuff, like he calls whale fish, and he's like, yeah, they're fish, it's fine. But you don't read it for literal, this is what it's like to be on a whaling ship. You read it because of the cosmic story of like this almost superhuman whale, and its conflict with Captain Ahab. And so, you don't read Moby Dick to learn about what it's like to be on a whaling ship. It's impressionistic. You go on it so you can kind of experience sort of what it's like, but it's not anything like the real thing. So for the same thing, I'm just going to say, be a canny reader, and be aware of things like stereotypes. Even though it's being written by an Asian American author who knows what she's talking about, you still, because she's writing for a wider audience, every author is going to kind of resort to some stereotypes in order to highlight what they're doing. Every book kind of does that, and you need to be aware of these because stereotypes can be really harmful if they're internalized, and if you just assume that that's what everyone's like. So read this like a novel. That seems pretty clear, but read it like a novel, and think of it more in terms of an exaggeration of a depiction of a culture in order to tell a very human story about a mother and a daughter. So just going to get that out of the way before we move on to the review. So getting into the actual review here, the first criteria that I use in my reviews is, do the characters feel like real people? And my answer to this is absolutely. I'm giving this one a green light. I love how Ruth's story is intensely relatable, and I mean that's probably just me specifically, but like I feel like the way that she deals with other people and deals with herself and how she sees the world is just so real and like sometimes uncomfortable, because she asks herself some questions, and it got me thinking. I was like, oh my god, that's right. And so like just the way that she writes people, she writes about, this is Amy Tan I'm talking about, not Ruth, but Amy Tan writes her characters' internal monologues so honestly and brutally that sometimes you have characters who just have thoughts that we've all had, kind of intrusive thoughts that you'd never voice aloud, but her characters think it, and it's really refreshing to have that kind of honestly addressed, when people are going through rough times, or when people lack confidence in themselves, or when people are facing a difficult decision, the things that they go through. And I love the way that she writes her characters, because it connects with you in a way that feels so honest and real. The characters in the present storyline, the kind of frame story, that was kind of my favorite because it was very grounded, and I loved seeing Ruth's character arc as she comes to kind of understand things both about herself and about her mother. And I really, really I really, really loved that. The stuff in the past has kind of a little bit more of a kind of sheen of fantasy, but still we get to see Lu Ling, who's the mother, and we get to see her kind of idea of the world change over time. She's kind of raised when she's really young. There's lots of kind of old superstitions, and as things kind of move along, people are telling her, people don't really believe that anymore. That's kind of old ways of thinking, and you get to see her kind of come face to face with like the impacts of globalization during, or I guess before, but in the years kind of around World War II. The 20th century was really, after World War I especially, was really when you got to see like a lot more interaction between different cultures in a widespread way. And so you see things like cultural shifts and changes as new ideas are kind of shared around the world. And I really like to see kind of her view of the world shift and change over time, which I thought was really interesting. And for Lu Ling's story, I really felt like I was really invested in seeing her succeed and grow. She's a really likable protagonist, and you really get to see all the things that she faces, and she doesn't ever fall apart. She just kind of accepts things and moves on and tries her best to adapt and change. And because of that, she has such a great arc, and it's just really gripping, and I just absolutely loved it. The next category in the review is, did the writing style draw you in? And I really love Amy Tan's writing. It's crisp and elegant. She is very good at describing mannerisms, like the things that people do, just little gestures, facial expressions, stuff like that, and it really, really draws you in. And she also has this way of just throwing out these absolutely gorgeous images, or literary devices or whatever, and just kind of throws it at you out of nowhere, and it just works perfectly. Like, you'll be reading something, she went into the kitchen and she picked up a cup and poured some coffee into the cup, kind of thing. And then like there'll be just sort of a moment or just an observation of something that's so poetic and gorgeous, and it just knocks you flat. It's just wonderful, and I love the way that she does that. So I'm definitely giving this one a green star, or a green light as well. I really, really enjoyed how she's able to blend kind of the more magical elements with the realistic. Now, this isn't a fantasy novel, and it's not even really a magical realism novel, but the world that she's describing is very much shaped by perception, and so it's like the mother's world when viewed through the daughter's eyes. It's like when you're looking at like an image of an image of an image, and so it tends to get a little romanticized and fancifulized. If that's not a word, I made up that word. That's a fake word. But it gets romanticized, and so the depictions of like Chinese culture through Ruth's eyes are kind of filtered through kind of her mother's idealism of what it was like, and then her perception of it. And so it's kind of, it is almost like she's living in a world where there's kind of magical elements that it's like there's magical elements that she can't interact with, and she's trying to understand them but can't, and she feels like her mother sort of lives in this sort of world of ghosts and spells and magic, even though like she knows rationally that's not true, but because her mother's experiences are kind of filtered through, Ruth is able to sort of construct a version of it in her mind. And I think that's where we get a lot of the stereotypes, is things are viewed through Ruth's eyes when she doesn't have the necessary context. So in that case, it's more like a feature than a bug. But I love the writing style, and it just is so wonderful. I've read 3 of her books now, and I definitely want to read. I think there's 3 more: The Kitchen God's Wife, The 100 Secret Senses, and Saving Fish from Drowning. And I want to read those as well. So I love the writing style. It's wonderful. So the third criteria of this review is, did the plot move at an appropriate pace? For this one, I'm giving it a yellow light, but I'm going to kind of explain that. I felt like the scenes that were set in the present moved at a really good pace. They flowed along really well. There was a lot of details, but you were able to kind of catch everything, and that was fine. I feel like the stuff set in the past moved, it was a little more uneven, and it covers a long stretch of time, and we do spend a lot of time in kind of certain sections, and then towards the end it does kind of race through quite a few years kind of pretty quickly. And so there was a couple characters who are introduced in certain sections, and there's a bunch of people introduced at once, because it was moving so fast, I didn't really catch who they all were or how they were important, and so I got a little bit lost here and there. But like, it didn't really detract from the reading experience that much, because Lu Ling's character arc does unite it, but there were a few places where I kind of wished it was a little bit longer, but at the same time, if it was longer, it might pull the pacing down the other direction and make it too slow. So perhaps it was just my perception of it. Maybe I just read that section really fast, but there's a period where, you know, all the characters are kind of the same. You get to know them over time. You see them grow and change, and then things change, and there's all of a sudden a whole new group of characters that she's interacting with, and I didn't quite connect with all of them in the same way because we didn't get to spend as much time with them. So that's just, you know, that's just here and there. But overall, I think the pacing was fine. It never felt draggy, which is something that you can do when you have like 2 different plot lines following 2 different characters. Sometimes they can move at different speeds, but I really, really enjoyed how things flowed together. And then in the final section, when kind of the 2 plot lines sort of connect together, I thought that was really satisfying, and the pacing there was fine. It was literally just a few sections in the past section where everything started to change really quickly, and there was kind of, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then that happened, and that happened, and it gets kind of quick, and you can tell that you're kind of like, we're rushing to the end of this part so that we can like connect back to the present. So that was kind of my only criticism of the pacing. Overall, I think it was fine. The fourth one is, were you still thinking about it after you finished it? I'm giving this one a green light. Absolutely. There was a lot of personal discoveries that Ruth made about herself that just kind of blew my mind. It was something that I found really relatable. I really connected with it. I thought it was just really well done, and this book really, really makes you think. And I was like, the fact that I'm doing this review anyways, like I finished reading this book like a week ago, and I really, really wanted to do a review. I felt like I hadn't said enough about the book as it was, and I really wanted to explore it a little bit more. So yes, absolutely, it really got in my head, and it really, really connected with me in that way. So the final one is, like, the final part of the review is, do you want to read it again? And this one is a little bit more complicated. I'm giving this one a yellow light as well. The reading experience itself was great. I did enjoy the book, and I thought it was really well written. It'll probably be a long time since I reread it, though, only because I found the ending to be a little too neat and tidy. Things wrapped up really well, and it was satisfying, but at the same time it wasn't, because it was almost too easy. And that's probably a spoiler, and I hate to ruin things, but like the reading experience going through the book from start to finish is a good one. I did enjoy the book. I did love how it was written. But it didn't end on, like, there wasn't a lot of ambiguity at the end. It felt a little too neat, and there was a few not coincidences, but like a few things that just kind of clicked into place a little too well at the end. and maybe that's just my own expectations. I always want to go in this, when you're reviewing a book, a lot of it is, where were you at the time in your life when you read this book, and how did you interact with it? So I'm not going to say, like, objectively the ending doesn't work, because I might read it again in the future and it'll be perfect, because, you know, it's a really well written ending. But at this point, and this is just my opinion, but at this point the ending didn't quite work for me, because I felt a little cheated out by a little bit more story. I felt like there should have been just a little bit more, to give us an ending that felt earned. And like, the Joy Luck Club didn't do that. The Joy Luck Club, when I read it, it was just a wonderful reading experience, start to finish. The ending was great, and it was a good ending, but it genuinely felt earned, and so it had a lot more impact. This one, I felt like it was very sweet, but I was expecting it not to be quite so cut and dry. But again, that might just be my opinion. But I am giving this one a yellow light, just because I got to the end and I kind of felt, oh, I feel like there should have been more, because I really enjoyed the journey these two characters were going on, and I wanted just a little bit more meat to it at the end. But maybe that's just me. I may read this again in 20 years and just be completely blown away by how wonderful it was, because the book is really well written. So, you know, be that as may, that's kind of where it is. So, oh, here comes Circe. She has to come say hi. So ultimately, that leaves us with a score of 3 green lights and 2 yellow lights. And which boils down to basically 4 out of 5 stars, which is still really good. I think that fits the book really well. Yes, Circe has a lot to say, because she liked this book as well. But 4 stars out of 5. This was a great reading experience. And it makes me want to keep reading more of Amy Tan's stuff. I know she also has a memoir that she published a couple of years ago. And I want to read that as well, because she writes so well, and her characters are just so good. And I really relate to them. Their emotional journeys are very, yes, their emotional journeys just speak to me in very specific ways. So I love that. But that is the end of my review. 4 out of 5 stars. This was a great book, and I really, really am excited to be able to talk about it some more. But I have to go take care of the cat now, because she needs attention. And, you know, yes, she needs attention, and it's just the worst when she doesn't get it. So I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I will see you next Monday.